The year was 1823, and the wind cutting through the river valley of the Grand did not simply blow. It scoured, stripping the moisture from the lungs and the hope from the soul, carrying with it the scent of pine resin, turning leaves, and the metallic tang of impending violence that seemed to hang perpetually over the unclaimed territories, like a shroud woven from smoke and shadow. Hugh Glass moved through this unforgiving tapestry not as a man who sought to conquer it, but as a creature who understood the brutal rhythm of its silence his, moccasins pressing into the damp loam with a reverence that belied the heavy hawking rifle resting in the crook of his arm, a weapon of iron and wood that felt less like a tool and more like an extension of his own weathered skeleton. He was scouting ahead of the Ashley Henry party, a ragged procession of trappers and opportunists seeking pelts in a land that demanded blood as currency, and the parley, silence of the thicket, was a lyre masking the primal fury that slept in the depressions of the earth waiting for the snap of a twig to awaken. It happened not with a roar, but with a sudden suffocating displacement of air, a massive shifting of shadows where the brush exploded outward, revealing the monstrous architecture of a grizzly, saw her fur matted with the sap of centuries and her eyes burning with a maternal rage that transcended the understanding of men. Glass had a fraction of a heartbeat, a singular agonizing moment where the world slowed to the lucid clarity of a dying flame, allowing him to raise the rifle and fire a desperate, thunderous shot that buried itself in the beast's chest, but lead was a poor argument against such ancient fury. The bear fell upon him with the weight of a collapsing mountain, her claws, curved like rusted scythes, tearing through the buckskin and the flesh beneath, shredding the muscle of his shoulder and exposing the white gleam of ribs that snapped with the sickening sound of dry, kindling under a heavy boot. There was no heroism in the dust, only the guttural wet sounds of butchery, the hot spray of arterial blood, painting the indifference of the wild berry bush, and the terrible grinding noise of jaws clamping onto his throat, crushing the windpipe, trying to sever the connection between head and heart, while Glass, blinded by his own blood and the sheer agonizing shock, stabbed blindly with his knife, a futile stinging insect against the god of the wilderness. By the time the rest of the trapping party crested the ridge, drawn by the gunshot and the screams that had dissolved in the wet, bubbling gasps, the sow lay dead atop him, a heavy, suffocating blanket of fur and death, and Glass was no longer a man but a ruin, a broken collection of meat and bone that somehow, miraculously, terrifyingly, refused to let go of the ghost. They dragged the bear off him, the wet slap of the carcass hitting the mud, echoing the nausea rising in their throats, and stared down at the carnage. His scalp was torn loose, hanging like a bloody flap over his eyes. His throat was laid open, so deep that bubbles of air escaped through the wound with every labored breath, and his leg was shattered, the bone protruding through the ruin of his thigh. Captain Henry, a man hardened by years of frost and deprivation, looked down with a grim resignation that mirrored the gray sky, seeing not a survivor, but a corpse that had simply forgotten to die. Yet they could not leave him, not yet, so they sewed him up with the cold efficiency of camp butchers, the needle passing through the tattered skin, the thread pulling tight the jagged edges of his humanity, binding the wreckage together in a mockery of healing. For days they carried him on a litter, a dead weight that slowed their march through hostile Arakawa country, every step a gamble with their own scalps, the slow procession dragging on until the burden became a chain around the neck of the expedition, the men muttering in the firelight, their eyes darting to the shadows, resentment festering like the gangrene beginning to smell sweet and rotten in Glass's wounds. The terrain grew steeper, the air thinner, and the decision was made, a decision born of pragmatism and fear, the cold calculus of the frontier that dictated the many should not die for the one who was already dead. 2 men were asked to stay, to hold the vigil until the inevitable last breath rattled free, to bury him and then catch up. The volunteers were John Fitzgerald, a man whose eyes held the flinty hardness of a soul eroded by greed, and young Jim Bridger, a boy of 19 whose conscience was still a tender, uncalloused thing, easily swayed by the older man's dominance. The price for their vigil was $80, a fortune for men who slept in the dirt, and as the rest of the company faded into the timber line, leaving the 3 of them alone in the vast swallowing, Silence, the atmosphere shifted from one of camaraderie to a predatory waiting. Days bled into nights, the sun hammering down on Glass's fevered, unconscious form, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that sounded like sandpaper dragging across stone. A rhythmic torture that grated on Fitzgerald's nerves, the older man pacing the small clearing like a caged wolf, watching the horizon for the silhouette of warriors, his patience eroding with every hour that Glass refused to succumb. Fitzgerald sat by the dying fire, cleaning his rifle, his gaze falling repeatedly on Glass's kit, the heavy and stat rifle, the knife, the flint, the powder horn, possessions that meant life in this wilderness, possessions wasted on a corpse. He began to whisper poison into Bridger's ear, words that spoke of the danger they were in, the senselessness of waiting for a dead man to finish dying, the logic that Glass was already gone, his spirit fled, leaving only the stubborn mechanics of the body behind. Bridger, terrified of the encroaching dark and the phantom warriors in every rustle of the leaves, tried to hold on to his honor, but honor is a heavy coat to wear when fear is stripping you bare. The breaking point came on the 5th day, when the wind shifted and carried the scent of wood smoke from the valley below, a sign of Indians, or perhaps just the mind playing tricks on exhausted men. But for Fitzgerald, it was the gavel striking the sound block. He moved with sudden, violent purpose, stripping the rifle from under Glass's broken body, the movement causing the mauled man to groan. A low, pitiable sound that should have elicited mercy, but instead drew only contempt. Fitzgerald pulled the knife from Glass's belt, took the powder, the shot, the very means of survival, and looked at Bridger with eyes that burned with a cold, terrifying rationality, telling the boy they had to leave now or die alongside this carrion. Bridger, trembling, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face, looked at Glass, who was awake now, his eyes open, staring up through the veil of pain and fever, unable to speak, unable to move, but seeing, understanding the ultimate betrayal, and then looked at the retreating back of Fitzgerald. The fear won. The boy turned and ran, stumbling after the older man, leaving Hugh Glass lying in the shallow depression of the earth, covered only by a thin layer of dead leaves and the immense crushing weight of his own mortality. He lay there as the sound of their footsteps faded to silence, rushing back in to fill the void, a silence that was heavier than the bear, sharper than the claws, for it was the silence of a man erased from the world of the living while his heart still beat. He was alone, unarmed, broken, and festering, the smell of his own rot filling his nostrils, the sky above him indifferent and vast, and in that moment of absolute fracture, where the soul should have shattered, alongside the bones something else ignited deep within the ruin of his chest. Not hope, for hope is a gentle thing, but a cold hard ember of hate, a refusal to accept the darkness, a spark that would burn hotter than the fever, and drive him to crawl inch by agonizing inch out of the grave they had dug for him in their minds. A suffocating blanket of dread that seemed to press the very breath from the lungs of the trappers who stood in a ragged circle around the ruin of what had once been Hugh Glass. And the leg twisted at an angle that defied the natural order of bone and sinew, leaking life into the thirsty soil that drank it without gratitude or pause. Marking time in a place where time had ceased to matter, and though the Major was a man forged in the fires of command, the sight of Glass, whose eyes rolled white and wild in the grip of a fever that was already claiming him, brought a pallor to his face that the dust of the trail could not hide. They carried him on a litter of rough-hewn saplings, a burden of meat and agony that slowed their march to a crawl, dragging the entire expedition into the paw. Crosshairs of the Arakawa war parties that haunted the periphery of their vision like ghosts woven from the prairie grass. And with every mile that the company limped forward, the resentment grew thick and palpable as the humidity rising from the river, for in this unforgiving wilderness charity was a luxury that cost blood and the price of keeping. A dead man walking was becoming too high for the living to pay. It was Fitzgerald who first voiced the darkness that had taken root in all their hearts, his eyes hard and flat as river stones, calculating the odds of their survival against the weight of the dying man. His voice a rasp of pragmatic cruelty that cut through the weary evening air, suggesting that nature be allowed to finish what the Salbear had begun yet. Major Henry, bound by a code of honor that felt increasingly fragile here at the edge of the world, could not bring himself to put a bullet in the brain of a man who still clung so stubbornly to the ragged edge of existence. Thus the bargain was struck. A devil-esque pact sealed with the promise of $80, a fortune for men whose lives were measured in beaver pelts, and powder to any two who would stay behind and watch the candle of Glass' life flicker out, to give him a Christian burial so that his bones might not be scattered by wolves. A task that fell to the mercenary cynicism of Fitzgerald and the youthful, malleable conscience of Jim Bridger, the boy who stayed out of loyalty and fear, and the man who stayed for the coin, watching the rest of the brigade vanish into the swallowing horizon until the silence rushed back in, absolute and terrifying. For 5 days they waited a vigil of flies and festering wounds where the only sounds were the wind hissing through the cottonwoods and the delirious moans of Glass, who refused to die with a tenacity that shifted from miraculous to grotesque. His body turning black with gangrene, the sweet cloying scent of rot drifting from his wounds to summon the scavengers that circled high in the pale, indifferent blue waiting for the movement to cease. Bridger, young and tormented by the phantoms of the night, washed the fever sweat from Glass's brow with river water, whispering apologies that the dying man could not hear, while Fitzgerald sat cleaning his rifle, his patience eroding like a sandbank in a flood, his gaze constantly darting toward the tree line where he imagined the painted faces of the warriors watching, waiting there, impending violence, a pressure building behind his eyes. The turning point came not with a roar, but with a whisper of wind that carried a scent of smoke that might have been real or might have been the hallucination of a mind cracked by fear. But for Fitzgerald it was the final grain of sand. He stood over Glass, whose breath was now a shallow, rattling rasp, and declared that the man was already dead in every way that mattered, that staying another hour was suicide, a senseless sacrifice of 2 healthy lives for a corpse that simply hadn't gotten the message. Bridger pleaded, his voice cracking with the strain of his shattered morality, begging for just one more day, one more sun to set, but Fitzgerald's fear had hardened into a weapon, and he turned on the boy with a logic that was cold and sharp as a skinning knife, arguing that the were close, that they would be flayed alive if they were found, and that Glass, deep in his coma, felt nothing, knew nothing, and would be gone before the moon rose. The betrayal was a physical act of stripping of dignity that mirrored the bear's mauling. Fitzgerald knelt and took the heavy and stat rifle, the very soul of a frontiersman, slipping it from beside Glass's numb hand, then the knife, the flint, the pouch, and the blanket, leaving the man naked and defenseless against the encroaching night, arguing that the gear was wasted on the dead and was the rightful inheritance of the living who had risked their scalps to watch over him. Bridger, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and the dominating will of the older man, watched in mute horror as Fitzgerald kicked loose earth into the shallow depression where Glass lay, not enough to bury him deep, but enough to hide the shame of their abandonment, a dusting of soil over a chest that still heaved with faint, jagged rhythm. The boy wanted to scream, to put the rifle back, to stay until the end, but the primal urge to survive, ancient and overwhelming, seized him when Fitzgerald hissed that he could hear horses' phantom hooves that drove them to flee toward the river, scrambling up the banks, leaving behind the only thing that Hugh Glass had left, his life. As they ran, putting distance between their sin and their salvation, the valley fell silent once more, save for the wind which scoured the shallow grave, blowing away the thin layer of dirt to reveal the single, unblinking eye of Hugh Glass, open now, staring up at the canopy of leaves with a consciousness that had surged back from the abyss in the moment of their departure, a consciousness fueled not by hope, but by a cold crystalline rage that burned hotter than the fever, witnessing the backs of the men who had stolen his death and left him to a hell far worse alone, in the vast crushing emptiness of the American wild. The return to consciousness was not a sudden awakening, but a slow, suffocating claw through layers of black silt and fever dreams. A resurrection that felt less like the gift of life and more like a cruel joke played by a deity with a taste for prolonged suffering beginning, with the sensory assault of the earth itself, the damp, cloying weight of soil, packing his nostrils, the taste of copper and bile, pooling in the back of a throat that felt less like flesh and more like a ragged canyon of raw nerve endings. Hugh Glass did not open his eyes immediately, for to open them was to confirm the reality of the agony that radiated from the center of his being, a white-hot constellation of pain that mapped the geography of his ruin, the leg that throbbed with the dull, grinding rhythm of a smashed anvil, the ribs that grated against one another, like tectonic plates with every shallow, bubbling breath, and the back where the bear's claws had harrowed the muscle down to the white of the vertebrae, leaving furrows that now burned with the hellish heat of infection. When his eyelids finally fluttered apart, gummed together by dry blood and the grit of the riverbank, they revealed a world that was indifferent to his torment, a gray shifting canopy of cottonwood leaves filtering the pale light of a sun that offered no warmth, only the stark illumination of his abandonment. He was alone. The realization hit him with more force than the grizzly's paw psychic blow that stripped the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping, a wet sucking sound emitting not just from his mouth, but from the slash in his throat where the windpipe lay exposed to the uncaring breeze. He tried to call out, to summon the names of the men who had been sworn to watch over him, but the sound was a shapeless gurgle, a spray of red mist that painted the dirt in front of his face. He rolled his head to the side, a movement that caused him an eternity of nausea, his eyes scanning the clearing for the familiar shape of a boot, the smoldering remains of a fire, or the glint of steel. There was nothing but the trampled earth, the frantic boot prints of men who had fled, and the silence, a heavy, oppressive silence broken only by the cawing of a crow that sat high on a withered branch, head cocked, waiting with the infinite patience of a scavenger who knows the meat is not going anywhere. His hand, trembling like a leaf in a gale, groped instinctively toward his side, fingers curling to grasp the stock of his rifle, the unstacked, the one true thing in a world of lies, the extension of his will that had kept him alive in the high country. His fingers found only the depression in the soil where the weapon had lain. They had taken it. The shock of the theft was a cold bucket of water on the fever of his mind, clarifying the betrayal into a sharp, crystalline hatred. They hadn't just left him to die. That, perhaps, he could have understood in the brutal calculus of the frontier, where a dying man is an anchor dragging down the living. No, they had robbed him. They had stripped him of his knife, his flint, his powder, and his rifle, leaving him toothless and clawless, a naked piece of carrion served up on a platter for the wolves. Fitzgerald. The name didn't form on his tongue, but it burned in his gut, a coal of rage that provided the only warmth in his freezing body. He could see the man's face in the darkness of his memory, the shifting eyes, the greed, the callous pragmatism. And Bridger, the boy, pliable and terrified, led astray by the older man's malice. They had buried him alive, thrown a few spades of dirt over his breathing body, and walked away with his life strapped to their backs. This rage was a fuel, dirty and black, but it burned hot enough to restart the engine of his heart. Glass forced himself to move, the scream dying in his throat as he leveraged his weight onto his elbows. The pain was absolute, a blinding sheet of white that threatened to send him back into the dark, but he rode the wave of it, gasping, sweating, his vision swimming with black spots. He looked down at his body, the wreckage of a man. His leg was twisted at a sickening angle, the femur shattered, the limb swollen to the size of a log and turning the color of a bruise. His buckskins were tattered ribbons, stiff with dry gore, pasted to his wounds. He could smell the rot setting in, the sweet, sickly scent of gangrene that hung around him like a perfume, and he saw the movement in the lacerations on his back, the writhing white rice grains of maggots. A wave of revulsion washed over him, but he choked it down. He knew, with the grim knowledge of a veteran trapper, that the maggots were eating the dead flesh, cleaning the wound in a way he could not. They were his only doctors now. He had to move. To stay was to die, to become a pile of bleached bones scattered by coyotes, a cautionary tale told around campfires he would never see. He fixed his eyes on a scrub oak a few yards away, a distance that might as well have been across the Atlantic. He dug his elbows into the dirt, his fingers clawing at the roots and rocks, and he pulled. The drag was a symphony of agony, his broken leg trailing behind him like a sack of wet stones, every rock and thorn snagging on his raw flesh. He moved an inch, then another. The breath hissed through his throat wound, a rhythmic wheezing that marked his progress. Asterisk drag, scream, breathe. Drag, asterisk. The world narrowed down to the texture of the ground beneath his nose, the sharp edges of flint, the dry crumble of clay, the intricate veins of a dead leaf. He was no longer a man. He was a creature of the mud, a revenant crawling out of his own grave, propelled by a singular, obsessive purpose. He needed water. The thirst was a demon sitting on his chest, drying his tongue into a piece of old leather. He could hear the Grand River, its rushing waters mocking him, close yet impossibly far. He crawled toward the sound, a slow, agonizing slither that left a trail of disturbed earth and blood behind him, a signature written in the soil. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time had lost its meaning, measured only in the throbbing of his wounds and the shifting shadows of the trees. The sun dipped low, turning the sky into a bruised purple, and the cold descended, a sharp, biting chill that seeped into his bones. He reached a patch of buffalo berries, shriveled and tart, and shoved them into his mouth, dirt and all, chewing frantically, the sour juice stinging his ulcers, but providing a momentary ecstasy of moisture. He kept moving. He had to reach the water before the night took him completely. The twilight brought the predators. He could feel their eyes on him, the heavy, loping presence of wolves in the periphery, drawn by the scent of his decay. He grasped a sharp rock, his knuckles white, a pathetic weapon against the teeth of the wild. But he held it with the ferocity of a king holding a scepter. He would not be eaten. Not today. He reached the mud of the riverbank as the first stars pricked the darkness, the cold slime soothing his fevered skin. He lowered his face into the water, drinking deeply, the icy shock of it sending a jolt through his nervous system, washing the blood from his beard. He collapsed there, half in the water, half on the land, a broken thing held together by spite. He looked up at the vast, indifferent universe, the Milky Way sprawling above him like a river of diamonds, and he made a silent vow to the empty sky. He would crawl. He would crawl across the plains, through the blizzard, over the mountains. He would crawl until the flesh was stripped from his bones, until he found the men who had walked away. He would look into their eyes and show them the thing they had created. The wind howled through the valley, a mournful dirge, but Hugh Glass did not hear a funeral song. He heard a marching beat. He dug his fingers into the clay, the muscles of his shoulders bunching, the agony a constant screaming companion, and he pulled himself forward, one agonizing inch at a time, into the heart of the night. The transition from the animalistic desperation of the crawl to the calculated upright locomotion of the hunter was not a singular moment of triumph, but a grueling metamorphosis stretched across weeks of freezing rain and the onset of a winter that sought to bury the sins of the frontier under a blanket of indifferent white. A period where Hugh Glass ceased to be a survivor of the bear and began to manifest as an avatar of vengeance. A revenant fueled by a furnace of hatred so intense it seemed to keep his blood warm when the mercury plummeted and the cottonwood shattered in the frost. He had risen from the rot of his own grave, his leg a calcified ruin that screamed with a jagged, lightning-hot agony with every step, a constant reminder of the mortality that had been stolen from him, but the pain was no longer a signal to stop. It was the fuel. The rhythmic drumbeat of a war march played out in the solitude of the vast emptying plains where the buffalo herds moved like dark oceans against the horizon. He moved now not to save himself for the man named. Hugh Glass had surely died in that thicket by the Grand, but to reclaim the only things that mattered in a world stripped of God and grace, his rifle, the Enstat that fit his shoulder like a missing limb, and the lives of the two men who had stripped him of it, leaving him to the wolves and the worms. The landscape he traversed was a purgatory of gray sky and brown earth hardening now into iron as the temperature dropped, the wind howling through the coulees with the voices of the damned, sounding suspiciously like Jim Bridger's youthful stammering or John Fitzgerald's cold pragmatic dismissal hallucinations that danced in the taunts, periphery of his vision like heat waves off a skillet. Glass ate what the scavengers left, driving wolves from the steaming carcasses of fallen calves with a savage roar that tore from his throat like grinding stones. His eyes burning with a feral light that made even the coyotes keep their distance, for they recognized in him a predator of a higher order, something that had tasted death and spat it out because the flavor was lacking. He fashioned a crutch from a fallen branch, patting the fork with moss and scraps of his own ruined clothing, and with this third leg, he began to eat the miles, a staggering, lurching specter, moving relentlessly toward the Missouri, guided by the internal compass of his rage. Every mile was a battle against the seduction of surrender. The snow began to fall in soft, deceptive curtains that promised a warm, eternal sleep if he would just close his eyes, but every time his lids grew heavy. The image of Fitzgerald's back turning away, the sound of the shovel scraping the earth over his living body, would snap his eyes open wide and bloodshot, staring into the abyss of the twilight with a focus that could crack stone. He was hunting ghosts, tracking men who believed him to be a rotting pile of meat in the wilderness, and this asymmetry gave him a terrifying power. He was the inevitable, the inescapable consequence of their treachery, moving through the brush with the silence of a shadow, despite the ruin of his body. He found sustenance in roots that tasted of bitter earth and beetle larvae dug from rotting logs, the protein fueling the knitting of his flesh, the maggots he had allowed to fester in his back, having done their grisly work of cleaning the infection, leaving behind shiny, puckered scars that pulled tight across his ribs like rawhide drying in the sun. The river became his road, the Missouri a serpentine beast of gray sludge and ice flows that he followed with religious devotion, knowing that the water flowed toward civilization, toward the trading posts, toward the men who were spending his coin and carrying his gun. There were nights when the fever returned hot and delirious, where he would lie shivering under a shelf of rock, speaking to the empty air, bargaining with demons, rehearsing the speeches he would never give for. He knew that when the moment came there would be no words, only the wet thud of a knife or the crack of powder. He hallucinated the weight of the Anstad, in his hands the smooth cold walnut of the stock, the balance of the barrel, a phantom limb sensation that was more painful than the knitting bone in his thigh, because it represented his identity as a frontiersman, an identity Fitzgerald had stolen along with his kid. To be without a rifle in this country was to be naked, to be less than a man. And Glass felt this castration acutely, a gnawing shame that transmuted into a cold, hard resolve. He tracked their passage not by footprints, for the snow and wind had long since scrubbed the earth clean of their physical trail, but by the logic of the frontier. He knew where they would go, knew the greed of Fitzgerald would lead him to the nearest post to liquidate the plunder, knew the fear in Bridger would make him pliable, a follower in the wake of the older man's wickedness. Glass became a student of the landscape's cruelty, reading the flight of ravens and the bend of the grass, understanding that the wilderness was not his enemy, but the arena in which his judgment would be rendered. The wind flayed the skin from his face, turning his beard into a mask of ice, his lips cracking and bleeding. But he felt it only distantly. His consciousness retracted deep into the citadel of his mind where the fire of his objective burned. He passed through the territories of hostile tribes, a ghost walker, whom the Arakawa scouts might have seen as a bad omen, a twisted spirit left alone to wander the badlands. For he moved with a disregard for safety that bordered on madness, stepping over rattlesnakes sluggish with the cold waiting, through freezing creeks that turned his moccasins to blocks of ice. The physical distance to Fort Kiowa was measured in hundreds of miles, but the psychological distance was measured in inches, the inch of steel he intended to bury in Fitzgerald's chest, the inch of breath he would watch leave the man's lungs. As the weeks bled into a month, the man who walked out of the wilderness was no longer the Hugh Glass who had ascended the river with Ashley's 100. He was something carved from the bedrock of the American West, a creature of grit and silence, his humanity shed like a winter coat to reveal the hard, unyielding predator beneath. He reached the bluff overlooking the river bend, where the smoke of the fort finally rose like a gray prayer into the slate sky, and he did not smile, did not weep, did not fall to his knees in gratitude. He simply stood there, a ragged silhouette against the dying light, the wind whipping the rags of his buckskins, his eyes fixed on the distant wooden palisades, not as a sanctuary, but as a hunting blind, the place where the prey would eventually come to drink, where the ledger would be balanced in blood, and where the legend of the man who crawled out of his own grave would finally, violently collide with the men who had dug it. The wooden gates of Fort Atkinson did not open so much as they groaned in protest against the biting wind, admitting a figure that seemed less a man of flesh and blood than a construct of the wilderness itself, a towering, ragged silhouette forged from the very blizzards that had sought to bury him, and the frozen mud that had cemented his broken bones into a lattice of agony, an iron will marking the final terminus of a journey that defied the natural laws of God and the pragmatic expectations of men. Hugh Glass stepped across the threshold of civilization not as a returning hero, but as a nightmare made manifest his presence, in the flickering lantern light of the mess hall, sucking the warmth from the room as surely as a draft from an open grave, for he carried with him the stench of old blood, the musk of the bear, and the terrifying hollow silence of the grave that had been dug for him on the banks of the Grand River. The soldiers and trappers gathered their men who had seen the worst of the frontier, who had traded their souls for pelts and their humanity for survival, fell silent as the heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the howl of the prairie wind, but trapping them inside with something far more volatile, a tension that vibrated in the air like the hum of a telegraph wire pulled past its breaking point. Glass moved with a hitch in his gait, a physical memory of the leg that had been snapped and knit back together by sheer stubbornness, his boots thudding against the rough-hewn floorboards with a rhythm that sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock, his single good eye sweeping the room not with the frantic energy of a hunter, but with the cold dead certainty of a judge who has already signed the warrant. He was looking for the ghost who walked the men who had stood over his broken body, stripped him of his rifle and his knife, and left him to the mercy of the wolves and the frost. And as his gaze settled upon the familiar, terrified faces of the young Jim Bridger and the callous-hearted mask of John Fitzgerald, the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in until the entire universe consisted only of the victim and his betrayers locked in a silent orbit of guilt and retribution. Bridger, mere months older than a boy but aged decades by the weight of his sin, looked as though he might vomit from the sheer terror of seeing the dead rise, his hands trembling so violently that the tin cup he held rattled against the table, a pathetic metallic percussion to the heavy silence, his eyes wide and wet with the realization that the nightmares which had plagued his sleep had finally stepped into the waking world to claim their due. And in that moment, the fires of vengeance that had kept Glass warm through the freezing nights, that had fueled his crawl through the mud and his limp through the snow, began to flicker and change hue, transforming from a desire for blood into a profound, crushing realization of his own superiority. He looked at Fitzgerald, the man who had orchestrated the abandonment, the man who had rationalized treachery as pragmatism, and saw a creature far more wretched than himself, a hollow man filled with nothing but greed and the cold logic of survival at any cost, a man who would never understand the spiritual alchemy that had occurred in the crucible of the wild. Glass raised a hand not to strike, but to point, his finger a gnarled talon of accusation that pinned Fitzgerald to his seat. And the words that finally tore themselves from his throat were not a scream of rage, but a gravelly whisper that carried more weight than thunder. a declaration that he had walked through the valley of the shadow of death not to become a murderer, but to prove that he was something the wilderness could not digest, and that men like Fitzgerald could not diminish. The tension in the room broke not with a gunshot, but with the heavy, suffocating realization that Glass was not going to kill them, because killing them would be a release, a termination of their suffering, whereas leaving them alive, forcing them to exist in a world where Hugh Glass walked the earth, where the legend of his survival would follow them into every trading post and every dark saloon, was a far heavier sentence to bear. He stepped past the trembling Bridger, his hand brushing the boy's shoulder in a gesture that was half benediction and half curse, leaving the lad sobbing into his hands, and moved toward Fitzgerald, who remained frozen, his hand still hovering over his pistol, paralyzed by the sheer enormity of the Revenant's presence. Glass reached out and took the Anstat rifle, his fingers closing around the cold steel with the familiarity of a lover, reclaiming his soul from the man who had tried to pawn it, and without a word, he turned his back on them. A gesture of ultimate dismissal that stung more than any bullet, for it signaled that they were no longer worth the effort of killing, that they were beneath his vengeance, merely debris left in the wake of his legend. He walked back toward the heavy oak door, soldiers parting before him like the Red Sea, their eyes wide with awe and fear witnessing the birth of a myth in real time, the transmutation of a trapper into a deity of the high plains, and as Glass pushed open the door and stepped back out into the swirling white void of the night, the wind howling its approval, he left behind a room full of men who were alive, but diminished, while he, the man who had died 1,000 deaths, walked away into the storm, eternal, unbreakable, and finally completely free, his silhouette swallowed by the snow, until nothing remained but the story, a tale that would be whispered around campfires for 100 years. The legend of the man who crawled out of his own grave to show the world that the human spirit is the only thing in the wild that cannot be killed.